the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have a special guest, Hadi. He's an author of a book that recounts that is a fictionalized memoir about Iraq and his life and the life of his friends. The novel is called Lives Shattered Across the Mountain Rocks. It's now available on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, and Apple Books. And Haiti comes from Sinjar, which is home to a very significant community of Yazidis as well as other Iraqi minorities. And the events of the novel take place from the time of U.S. mission. Um, uh, through the event from a U.S. mission that his friend participated in, and the book was inspired by the life of his friend Barkat Ali, and through the Yazidi genocide by ISIS in 2014. We'll talk more about it later. Higi, thank you so much for joining us today. Obviously, this is a great accomplishment and also sheds light on a very sensitive topic, on events that were widely covered in the media, but nevertheless remain largely unknown to most people in terms of the details and the impact on ordinary people, especially since the entire subject of Iraq, of U.S. actions in Iraq, has been widely controversial and politicized. Um, but let's start from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and the events that brought you to write about this book. How did you, what inspired it, and how did you decide that you want to talk about this?
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much, Rina, for having me. And I hope your audience and viewers will enjoy this conversation. Uh, I was born in Sinjar, and I spent most of my life in Iraq. I went to a small high school in Sinjar, and then graduated from the University of Mosul. But the same year I graduated, the U.S. Army and the coalition forces uh, uh, occupied or liberated, depending on how people view it, the Iraq, and I started working for them right away after my graduation in 2003. I worked 7 years for the U.S. Army. Then I had to flee Iraq and go to Jordan with my entire family, not only immediate family, but siblings, my father and stepmom and everyone. And then after 2 years, I was granted a special immigrant visa to come to the United States, and I came to Nebraska. And I have been living in Nebraska since. Married, I have two kids, and then in Nebraska, I got my teaching certificate. I taught in one of the high schools here in Nebraska for 5 years. And during that period, I also got my master's in education, and then went back to get my PhD. And during my PhD, I worked for as a TIA teacher assistant, UNL teaching undergrad classes. And so when in 2007, I lost one of my best friends. He was killed in a mission with the U.S. Army. And it was a small team of special forces, and there were only three of us, three interpreters working for that team. I was home at that time. And one of the reasons I was home because my friend had a baby before then, and he had to go home, and we switched our kind of leave schedule. And then they went to a mission, and a suicide bomber blew himself up among them. And my friend was there, and he with other two Iraqis got killed, and many Americans got wounded. And and not only because he was a good friend and a good human being, and of course we were friends and working together, and used to like have this conversation, trying to understand the things were happening to us, and talking about our childhoods, about our love stories, and also trying to understand the events we were seeing around us. There was a lot of terrorism, of course. There were a lot of sectarian violence going on, and there were a lot of political violence, and there were so many things that we were trying to grapple with, and we would talk about those issues. And another reason, because I was personally supposed to go to that mission, and the only reason I was not on that mission is because, like I said, he had a baby and we had to switch our leave schedule, and I was home during that mission. So I kept his memory with me. There was something that I never got over it. And so I never knew, because his family, after ISIS came, his family had to flee and leave everything behind. They were living in a tent. I was in the United States, and I not been able to do anything basically for them, because I was myself as a student, and as an immigrant in US, I was struggling, barely able to fill the needs of my family and take care of my family. And so but there was something, it kept in my mind after I went back to school and studied PhD, and I started working on my dissertation. And at night, I would decide, there were sometimes I would decide not to work on my dissertation. Uh, it was, I would decide, like, after, let's say, 6 or 7 p.m., that I have to stop not working on my, of course, that not always was feasible. Sometimes I had to work. But also, I decided to decide my best to take weekends, afternoons, and evenings off for myself and my family. And but then I was, during that time, I was like, maybe I can try to write a story, because my friend, he spoke Kurdish, Arabic, English, and French. He loved this poetry, storytelling. He used to write like stories. Sometimes he would share things with me. He had other friends, of course, that they considered themselves like a group of writers. But unfortunately, because of Yazidi being a minority, and also persecuted, and of course, and no one would take a person like him seriously. Nobody probably would want to hear his perspective. Nobody would help him to publish any of his book. It was not like now you could go and publish your own books or put them online for the people. So we didn't have any of that privilege. And he had many things in his computer, and even his computer, as his family told me later, because his brother decided to put his computer aside, and because the family was devastated about losing him. And but then later, as far as I, after ISIS attacked Sinjar, they lost everything, including the computer. So there were very few things that were left from the things he tried to write and communicate. And so I decided, when I was writing my dissertation, I was like, I will try to write something. I'm not as good as writer as him. I'm more of a, you can say, I'm in education. I like to write in an academic way whenever it's possible. There are other things that I am probably more interested in, but this is something I can do for my friend, or at least try. So this is where the idea of the book came from, and that's what I would just, during the night when the kids would go to sleep, because they would go to sleep early because they have school. I would just try to take some time and kind of brainstorm, what do I want to tell and how I wanted to tell it. I know this is probably, I know you have probably too many questions, but one more comment, and then I will leave it back to you. That is, but at the same time, I wanted to keep his real life private, but I wanted to write something about who he was as a person, our conversations, I mean, his talent, but I did not want to write about his private life because I felt I'm not the person who should do that. And especially, I've never talked to his family about that.
So that seems to be both, in many ways inspiring, but also a painful subject because, you know, the fact that his writings were lost itself is part of the horrific atrocity that was inflicted by ISIS and its network. That I think it would be I think before we get into that and talk more about him and more about what you were the story you were trying to tell, I think it would be helpful to talk a little bit about the context of these events, the events leading up to the genocide, and also the story of who the Yazidis are, why they were so persecuted and discriminated. I know there's a lot of media publicity, but nevertheless, not frankly, reading what the media published on the subject, it was always focused more on ISIS and their actions than on the lives that they've disrupted. And I think it's time to kind of focus on different stories.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think, again, I hope I did a good job. I mean, I did it for a friend of mine. I've never written any stories. This is the first story. I certainly wrote it from heart, but even in the story, answer some of the things you said. It's try to show that who were the people that were affected by ISIS and why and how those people felt. And then in the story, it's again there is a story of female captivities and ISIS attacking and killing people. That's also part of the story. And like you said, so this is something that probably media, I mean, not, I would say, not covered it enough. I mean, in the term of the Yazidi genocide, I still feel media uh, did did a good job overall, but we still need more stories of who were the people affected and more stories of bringing humanity up and how really people were affected by and why they did the things they did. And like you said, to just give you a very brief background to your viewers and listeners, that I mean, Yazidis is one of the Middle East or Iraqi minorities. And now they live in Iraq mostly, but we had 150,000 Syria, or some people say 90,000, but now there is about 5,000 since the war started in Syria. We had 80 Yazidi villages, completely Yazidi villages in Turkey before the Second World War. Now there are zero. There are a handful of families left in Turkey. And as far as we know, there are no anyone left in Iran because of the persecution. And some of them made it to Europe, some of them made it to Armenia, then from Armenia to Russia. They've been in Armenia and Russia and Georgia for over a century. But even in those countries, especially in Georgia, they faced struggle at the beginning from some fundamental Christian groups, unfortunately. So, and then the reason ISIS did that, because to them that these people are basically infidels, and that's what ISIS in their newspaper Daba in the fifth edition, and they wrote an whole why they targeted the Yazidi and why they did the things they did, and basically what they said is these people are not Muslim, never been Muslim. They are infidels. They are not the people of book, meaning they are not Christians, Jews, or Zoroastrians. So the only way that Muslims can and should deal with, according to, of course, their interpretation of their religion, that the men should be killed and women and children should be enslaved, and all their cultural heritage should be destroyed, and no traces of their culture should be left. So that's why when they attack the Yazidis, they attack them in a way that it was different than they attacked the others. For example, in Mosul City, in around Mosul City, they give the Christians a choice of either paying jizya, alimony money, or leaving the Islamic lands. But that choice was not available to the Yazidis because Christians were considered the people of the book, but Yazidis were not. So that choice was not available.
So let's talk about the Yazidis and who are they? How did they end up in these particular areas, and what do they believe? What is the culture and the religion like?
So I usually, when I personally talk about, I'm not a scholar of religion. I'm not a religious leader. I am more of a secular person. So when I talk about topics of religion, I usually do my best to talk about it from a very archaeological, historical, and do my best scientific perspective. And from this perspective, Yazidis, one of the remnants of ancient Iraqi civilization, mostly probably they are, and their religion is probably mostly connected to Mithraism, one of the ancient Iranian religions. And of course, they speak Kurdish, one of the most of them, but we have some people who speak in a Lebanese dialect, and they've been living in that area. But also there are also other ideas affected their cultures and their beliefs, especially the Islamic Sufism, which can trace its origin to again to Persia. So these ideas of Sufism was actually the Islamic idea of Sufism was influenced by Persian ideas, but then Yazidis also influenced, and we have many well-known Sufi people during from 9th to 11th century that Yazidis consider them their saints, consider them because Yazidis believe in reincarnation. They were the reincarnations of some of their ancient saints and gods, and so that is. But they were about a probably people estimated about a 500,000 in Iraq, and probably stay still about the same number, despite that since the genocide, more than 100,000 left Iraq.
What was the life like before ISIS came?
So I mean, during the Baath Party, life was difficult because I mean, the Baath Party forced Yazidis to identify as Arabs. They put their IDs Arab because they did not want to. They wanted to disconnect them from and the Kurdish speaking population, and also from the what was happening in farther north in Kurdish areas from guerrilla fights and from resistance. And so because they were, most of them, they were in Sinjar, and they were disconnected from the other Kurdish lands by an area were inhabited by Sunni Arabs. So they forced them to identify as Arabs, and they put on our IDs as Arabs. They were, to some extent, were free to do their things at home, but they were not allowed to share their beliefs or culture with others. There were nothing in the Iraqi, like you say, education curriculum about the Yazidi culture. There were nothing positive about the Yazidis in any books were published in Iraq or any magazines. Yazidis were not allowed to be judges, police officers, and so many other things because they said that the Yazidis, as non-Muslim, cannot have the right and the power to judge Muslims, and the police, being a police or a judge, will give them that right. And they were living mostly in areas where they were almost entirely Yazidis. They were persecuted, I mean, and they were discriminated against everywhere in education, politics, and governments, and economy, everything. So the Yazidis mainly relied on agriculture, raising animals, and being things like teacher, nurses, and sometimes doctors. They will give a few probably Yazidi students the chances to be doctors and so forth. So it was difficult. But then after 2003, we thought things going to change. Despite that, we had more freedom and more Yazidis went to school and more Yazidis started owning their own businesses and things changing. But there was always the fear of attacks. For example, in the same year that I lost my friend, in July of 2007, they attacked four Yazidi towns, Al Qaeda back then. And by the way, as far as I know, Jolani, the new leader of Syria, was there, and he's accused of that attack. It was the second biggest explosion after 9/11 back then,
Hmm.
and more than 375 people got killed, and more than that number was wounded. And until today, Al Qaeda claimed that they did it, but until today, there's no one has been prosecuted for that, or not. No one even tried to find out what happened and who was behind it. So was one of the attacks, but there were so many attacks. So despite that, there was more economic chances. There were more school chances for Yazidis, and things were in some way were more positive, but there were things were actually getting worse.
In what sense were they getting worse?
Yeah, in a sense, they were living under a constant threat. That there were back then Ansar Sunnah, there was Al Qaeda, there was Jihad with Tawheed. So there were so many groups, and Yazidis were one of their targets, and they constantly target the Yazidis. And so we had to live with that, you can say duality, that a duality that somehow things are improving when it comes to economy, when it comes to education, when it comes to even freedom of expressing yourself and your culture and practicing your culture. But at the same time, there was the constant fear of who's going to take over the government, when the next attack will be, and if I travel, would I will face a checkpoint that will be a fake checkpoint by one of these radical groups, and they would just take me out of the car and shoot me and kill me. So it was I mean, strange times, you can say.
In the midst of all of it, how did you meet your friend?
So my friend and we knew each other. I mean, we were from the same town. We went to the same high school. We were not very close friends in high school. Despite that, we knew each other. We used to sometimes play soccer and meet and say hi. But other than that, we were not close friends. But then we had to work together for the U.S. Army, and then we had to live in the same room with my brother also was there, and a couple other friends were there. And but then some people would leave and he and I would stay, and then some other people came, so we lived, we were roommates for at least few years. And then, so during that time, because of everything we were seeing, like facing death every day, going to mission and doing all that, all those things, we would take an hour or two before the dawn, before the sunset, and go and talk and just have conversations about our passions for books, and talk about our childhood, talk about our high school, talk about soccer, talk about life, and then question things. And so it turned to be to a time that we both found it like a happy hour or a happy couple hours, just to kind of try to forget about all the sad events and things we are seeing. And sometimes we would be joined by some U.S. Army soldiers. Sometimes we would be joined by other interpreters. And then the book was basically based on those conversations we had, and that friendship we made, and try to make sense of the world.
Let's talk about death The tragic mission where he and the two others lost their lives. What what was the mission about?
So we used to go to on regular basis to go to mission like few times a week, mostly by helicopters, by Black Hawks. So we would just go and kind of do a reconnaissance or just go survey an area, and sometimes we will have information about some activities of, for example, some either terrorist groups or some movement of weapons through some desert routes and things. And so we would just go check. And that was one of those kind of missions, regular mission that turned into a tragedy.
How did you find out?
So yeah, so that's I was my friends and uncle actually kind of post a comment on when I kind of put on Facebook that I have the book. And he said, I still remember the day that you and we had to go from our town, Khanasor, to go to the US base and check whether the news we heard that they were true. So I was home and his uncle called me. He said, "We heard some bad news. Have you heard anything?" I was like, "No, I have not heard anything." He said, "Somebody called me speaking an Egyptian dialect, and he told me that is something bad had happened during the mission last night, and we want you to come to the base. Unfortunately, we have some bad news for you." So I am guessing from the cultural differences that probably the US team told the interpreter to tell them the truth, just to tell them, we are sorry, and we have lost many other people. Some got wounded, and your son was among them. But I think so because of the Middle East culture, he did not tell them. He kind of wanted them to come to go by themselves and find out. So he told them something bad had happened during the mission last night, and we want you to come. But of course, the family understood that if he was alive, that person wouldn't hide that important detail. We just tell them something bad had happened. He's wounded, or he's still alive, and or he so something like that. So his uncle told me, I think we lost Barkat, but we have to go check. And I was like, no, no, nonsense. I mean, it's never been safer than now. I mean, we went to many dangerous missions, and we're still alive. And now we just go and scan areas and with the helicopter, and we barely see anyone. We don't even, most of the time, we don't even land. There's absolutely nothing. But we went to the base and they waited outside. I went inside and they told me the truth. And I had to go back outside the base and basically tell two of his uncles and a friend of us what had happened. Um, and that's what his uncle actually wrote for me, just kind of describing the very moment I came out of the base and I told him the news.
What happened right afterwards? What was
Yeah, so we went home. It's sad, and we we couldn't make sense of what had happened, and and we barely talked. And I remember the only thing that I remember vividly that actually his uncle was consoling me and rather kind of trying to keep his emotions kind of to himself. Again, you're familiar with the culture. He was the oldest among us, and he was consoling me all the way home. But when we got home, I asked him to drop me on the street because I didn't tell them, but I in deep myself, I was like, I cannot go and face his mom, his wife, his brother. I can't. So, but they understood when I asked them, was like, just please drop me on the main street outside the town, and we go.
I've always wondered, given that Yazidis have such a small population, why were there so many that were going on these dangerous missions with the US military?
So again, in 2003, there were not too many jobs. That's
Mhm.
one of the reasons. Second, Yazidi areas were among ourselves. We did not have an issue with neither the West nor the US, neither the US Army. So we didn't have people in our communities that would target us for working for the US Army. And so many Yazidis found it an employment opportunity. I was one of them. I never thought it's gonna turn into a matter of life and death, and I will be wearing uniforms and vests and helmets and carrying a weapon or even being trained. Or even in my life, I never thought I would be the person who's owning a gun or shooting a gun. But it was so many people, not only as an interpreters, but many worked at those spaces as guards, workers, but also so many Yazidis joined the new Iraqi army, and it was as dangerous as being an interpreter.
What happened with the Bashar's family after his death?
So they were living in a tent for a few years, and some of my friends from the U.S. Army and we tried to get him the visa. So we start reaching out to people in the government, and then finally we were able to, uh, uh, through a friend of mine in the army, to reach to a journalist from Star and Stripes, the military kind of main media outlet, and they published an article about him and his how his life, and he protected actually American soldiers in doing so. And one of the American soldiers actually described that. He said, I mean, I am one of them, that he protected me. I mean, he was right in front of me, and was the first one. He went there and started questioning these people, and I would be dead without him. And then Fox TV picked it up. There was a small report about that, and it was something on their website. And but then we start the processing of because of the visa, because they already kind of had the documentation they needed to apply for the special immigrant visa, and now they are actually in Lincoln.
And what happened to the terrorists?
I mean, the one who blew himself up. I mean,
Obviously.
both of them died. There were two of them. They died, and they were just
Mm-hmm.
they because they were died and left there.
Mm-hmm. So what what following those operations and following the emergence of ISIS, what what was happening to the community? At what point, who was able to how did who was able to get out, and and how did all these people uh, not manage to get out? How did it work in terms of who managed to survive and go elsewhere, and who ended up having to stay there and face what happened?
Yeah, so again, there were some Yazidi towns that were farther north, close to the Kurdistan regional of Iraq, and they were pretty much almost safe. The ISIS got into their towns, but the Kurdish forces, with the help of the U.S. Air Force, they took them back in a day. Then there were other areas close to Mosul who Yazidis escaped. The ISIS took over for few days or a few weeks, and they were also liberated. But Sinjar was in kind of in the middle of Al Jazeera area in the desert, and they were surrounded by Arab Sunni tribes and Arab Sunni towns, and when ISIS attacked the south side of the mountain, and most of the people from the south, but also mostly from the north, they just escaped, and most of them made it to Kurdistan. But unfortunately, so many of them that did not have the mean to do that, or they were too late, or they were confused about who are these people. Are they the Ba'ath Party again coming back? Are they just Sunnis trying to resist what was going on, and they felt the injustice they described they are facing. So there were so many people also confused. So that many of them went to the mountain, many of them were captured in their homes, not knowing what exactly had happened and to do. So it was a lot of times it was sheer luck.
At the peak of these events, of course, there was a lot of media talking about what was going on. Was there no ability, whether for the Iraqi government or for the Kurdish forces, to get to Sinjar in time? What was the situation like at the time?
So I mean basically, I mean, the Iraqi army collapsed. They just uh, they just left their posts, and just simply some of them throw their weapons, some of them put some civilian clothes on and try to blend in, and a lot of them even try to go together, escape together in their military vehicles. So they just abandoned their posts. But for the Peshmerga, they left during the night and early morning without telling people. And still, that is a question we don't have an answer to it. Like, what exactly happened? Why, or at least why they did not notify people, ask them to also leave because they are leaving. And so the official in Kurdistan, they said we could not. ISIS basically had better weapons. They had taken over the American weapon were left by Iraqi army, armored vehicles. So they were militarily in a better position, and also that Kurdistan was in danger, and that ISIS was getting close to like areas like the Hawk City, those places. But again, the question, like who took the decision, why, how, why they did not tell the people, these questions that unfortunately we don't have answers for them, and we never were given answers for them.
So there was no official investigation afterwards or anything like that?
Of course not.
Mhm. So what happened to the remnants of the Yazidi communities in Sinjar after all of that was over?
So yeah, soon after, more than 80% of their homes were looted. All their shrines and cemeteries and holy places that ISIS could get to destroy them. And people from the surrounding town, from Arabic towns, started just looting homes randomly, and they enslaved about 7,000 Yazidis. They killed more than that number. And if you compare that number to the US population, it's just like killing an entire state. I mean, not only a small state, like a state with a 10, 20 million people in it. It's just imagine if imagine the devastation in a situation. And people ended up in tents, basically, sometimes on streets and schools and everywhere in Kurdistan. And and just not knowing uh, what's going to happen, what is next, whether they will ever get their lives, their areas, anything back. And it's still, until today, there is still more than half of those people live in tents. About a half, probably, or maybe less, a little less, went back to Sinjar after they gave up that the government will do anything for them, or they will rebuild their areas or homes. And they gave up on everything, and they just went and tried to rebuild their homes with what they could.
So was it ever completely rebuilt or not?
Yeah, I mean, so the international community has spent a lot of money there. There are some schools are rebuilt, many other schools are renovated. There are hospitals and clinics are either being built or renovated, and there are some roads and other things being fixed by the Iraqi government. But comparing to what happened and comparing to what it should be the Iraqi government's responsibility is just it's just not even worth mentioning. But yeah, so the area still lack teachers, schools, nurses, doctors, hospitals, clinics. I mean, just and especially the water. I mean, there is the issue of water. It's a huge issue. It's an issue that's going to be one of the biggest issues in the future. It's just something that it's something needs to be done about it, or otherwise this time it would probably be the water that the reason that many people will have to abandon the area.
Why hasn't that caught the attention of the international community? The fact that the Iraqi government was not doing the job, the fact that there is a water crisis. After all, we have all these international fundraising events and COP29 and all of these things, and you know, and yet there's nothing is really
Yeah,
done.
I encourage your viewers to go and read the new report by by Yale about the Yazidi situation. I forgot exactly the name. It says a pathway. I think it start with the pathway to something. I encourage your viewer and listeners to go check. And so that report will details all the issues and problems and challenges that led to the current situation and why things are not improving or why they are not better. So again, it's too much to talk about. I would encourage your viewers and listeners to go back to that report, but also we also have a report about hate speech that it's not specifically about the question you asked, but it's also highlights some of the biggest challenges that Yazidi face now and that have not been addressed seriously. And one of them is the hate speech.
So you're saying that there is continuing anti-ECG incitement?
Yes, I mean, again, if you go to check our just published report, you would see that not only us, but there are other organizations and individuals, and like the organization of Al Masarat and others, they have documented thousands, tens of thousands, and sometimes even hundreds, or in some cases millions of incident of hate speech against the Yazidis recently.
So would you say that it's actually rising back up now?
It's not, so anything like can trigger these hate speeches and violence. So there was an incident that some people accused Yazidis of burning a mosque, which then and then it was confirmed by the head of Sunni endowment in Mosul and by everyone that that was not true. And there was the Yazidi person, a religious figure, went to the mosque and took a video and posted it. Look, there is nothing here. All these are fake news. But despite that it was a fake news, that incident instigated millions, I can say millions of incidents of hate speech against the Yazidis.
Are there now any active clashes or any sort of actions of discrimination?
Well, there are constantly, discrimination, acts of discrimination against Yazidis everywhere. I mean, like just today, if you go watch the social media, especially what sometimes Yazidi post, and you can see it. That's like today there was a call for a rally to have a rally because of the discrimination that Sinjar faces when it comes to budget and services from the government of Mosul.
And what has been the impact of the US presence? Has it in any way deconflicted some of the tensions, or was it completely irrelevant?
It's certainly not irrelevant. I mean, in the case of Syria, I mean, the U.S. presence is crucial, and and then the same thing in the case of Iraq. So it's crucial because of the influence of the surrounding countries. And the U.S. president actually can be an, I don't want to say equalizer, but a force that can be there, that can manage that influence and also kind of sustain, the status quo, unfortunately, because otherwise there is uncertainty and lack of trust among the groups there, and anything could happen. And of course, if anything happened, Yazidis and other minorities would be the biggest losers. So the U.S. president, it's crucial for the region. I mean, despite that, sometimes the narrative, whether in the West or even in the East, that U.S. is being viewed as a colonizing power or so forth. But despite all those things, still the president is important.
There were several Yazidi organizations that emerged after the genocide. What happened to them? At one point, they were very active in the US and elsewhere, and there was a lot of media attention, but since for a while, I have not heard much about their direction and activity.
No, you're right. So again, I mean, that was a strong, a good reaction to a genocide. There are still many of them active. We have Yazda, for example, the organization that I founded. It's still active. We still do a lot of work in Iraq. We have other organizations like Free Yazidi Foundation and other organizations that, and many of them in Sinjar that still work and still do a lot of work and good work and important work. But so unfortunately, after the genocide, it's working in a humanitarian work, many people usually they give up because they have either other passions or they have to go find something that it will just they will be able to sustain their life or have a better life. And also because usually there is other issues in the world that there is more focus on other this, so there is an issue of not having enough funds and so forth. But what is unique in the Yazidi situation, unfortunately, because Yazidis were always living in poverty and persecuted, and so they did not have the political or the financial power to function in Iraq. And even us in the West, like for example, I had to work as a teacher, then I had to work as a TA, doing all that work. And now actually after finishing a PhD, I'm looking for a job to kind of be able to feed my family. And so and for us to be able to work on such a a tragedy and a genocide and deal with the genocide, you need people with education, with a lot of finance, and also need people who are free. They can dedicate their entire time to the cause. And unfortunately, you cannot find Yazidis who have that ability. Unfortunately, almost none. I mean, in the US, the communities knew we are barely are able to sustain our lives. In the Europe is almost the same and everywhere. So it's a challenge.
What so are you still involved with Yes then?
Yes.
What are the current needs and what are the top priorities of the organization at the moment? For those
So
of the listeners who are interested in getting involved or learning more and contributing in some way.
absolutely. No, so we still have many programs. We still have, for example, our documentation program, we help with the Survivor Initiative, try to also support the initiatives with the fund they need and also the support they need and consultation they need to go do their advocacy. We have a case management also program. We still are heavily involved in writing reports and collecting data about mass graves. We were working directly with UNITAD, the special investigation team that was formed by Security Council. Unfortunately, they left Iraq, but now we are the only, I think, probably international organization that doing that important job after they left. We also work with US and European government to prosecute their citizen who joined ISIS. And there are so many other things we basically do. But again, like I told you, we always in need of manpower. We always need help with so many things. And of course, money is always an issue. Being a nonprofit, not having a source of generating funds, we completely rely on generous funds from governments, organizations, and individuals.
Hmm. And what about cultural preservation? What, given how much destruction that happened during the genocide, and of course the fact that people had to leave, what is the status of that at the moment?
So we actually had a few cultural preservation projects, and we documented many of the Yazidi songs and traditions and made many videos and also we helped to rebuild one of the Yazidi shrines and we I mean my organization we did a lot of work around that but it, of course is not enough. Also there are other organizations, for example even universities like the University of Pennsylvania, they had a I think not sure how much fund from the U.S. State Department in USA to go and renovate the main Yazidi temple, the Lalish temple. There were also other attempts. So there is other attempts by University of Pennsylvania, but also other organization. Again, I mean, there are so many of them. Unfortunately, I don't remember so many of them, but there are attempt, but these attempts are not not enough. And one of the reasons they are not enough because again, Yazidis sometimes by themselves do not have the mean to do that. So the Yazidi community in Iraq almost entirely rely on the international community organization like ours to do that work.
What I what happens next? How do you what's the plan to keep the story alive and to keep the attention on on these important issues given how quickly the media fleets from conflict to conflict? For instance, just to give you an idea of why, you know, uh, looking at the Middle East studies education in most U.S. universities, there's very minimal attention to Middle Eastern minorities. The most of the education is focused on majoritarian perspective, basically the governments, the power players, and not, the minorities are mentioned, but possibly the ECG genocide is mentioned as an event, but the cultures are not studied. their religions are not well understood, and there's a very minimal understanding of the role all of these minorities have played in the Middle East. Is there some effort to kind of influence the US education to kind of incorporate more of this story before it gets erased from collective memory?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, to some extent, that the U.S. media and even the U.S. academia has done, I would say, a good job to some extent. But like you said, the issue is usually what happened in media and academia, larger community of groups, and then bigger issues sometimes take over the priority. For example, probably people who wants to be researchers and study issues, they would want to study probably an issue that is probably the relationship between China and the US, rather than go studying the what happened in the Middle East to a minority. And also the universities, because it's also the issue of funding, because when you apply for funds, there's always funding available for certain problems, certain issues, certain regions, certain government, and there are less funding for other things. And there's probably the Yazidi issues and other minority issues is probably one of them. I mean, that would probably have less funding, less opportunity, and will probably be less attractive to many scholars that who probably even passionate and want to do well in their areas. And so that's probably, in my opinion, these are some of the issues. But again, we want the more focus, because that is exactly that we should keep in mind, and not in academia and the media, that we would try to be aware of this issue, that it's not, yes, while these other issues are important and probably people would see them as a priority, or even sometimes because they are existential threats to larger groups or and the entire of humanity. But these other issues, that is also important, because again, we keep saying, if what happened before was a priority, probably what happened to Yazidis would not happen. And they would understand that, okay, we have did not do something about this group or this event or this genocide before. This is here where we failed. They would have plans, at least, how to react to something like ISIS, but nobody had a plan. Nobody knew what to do. Nobody knew even what was ISIS' true intention. Why? Because I think similar issues or similar tragedies to Yazidis were ignored before. So I think we should put more focus to not only help the Yazidis and other minorities and people in their situation, but also to avoid similar tragedies in the future, because it's going to happen again. Then what are we going to do? Are we just going to only react? Because all what we have been doing, I mean, as human beings in groups and societies and governments, institutions, just reacting to these strategies after the fact. So we don't have a plan to deal with it. We don't have a plan how to prevent it. So again, I would encourage people to take this perspective and see it why it's important.
So speaking of plans, we're hearing about the resurgence of ISIS in areas near Mosul and everywhere else. We're hearing obviously not only Al-Julani, but all these other factions have basically are taking over Syria. What is the plan to protect Yazidis and others going forward in case the situation gets out of control the way it did in 2014?
There are no plans, unfortunately. There's nothing. All what are Yazidis and other minorities in Syria and Iraq are hoping that there are some positive messages to some extent from Al-Jolani. Again, when I say that, he was in Al-Qaeda. He's accused of one of the biggest explosions that in killing more than 300 Yazidis in one December. But they say, okay, hopefully maybe things are different. Maybe different Syrian factions do not want to fight each other, do not want to kill us. Hopefully the Iraqi, especially Sunni population, came to realization that ISIS was not a good idea, and such a group should not come back and be in power. So there are no plan. All is there is just some hopes.
But there's no security framework or any sort of.
If something big happened, no, unfortunately.
So with the new US administration coming in, what is it that would be ideal for it to do in the going forward?
I mean, I think I can again say again the U.S. Present in the region. Again, I know the U.S. public opinion, the media, the government, especially the new administration, that we should not have boots on the ground. We should not be interfering in the region's conflicts, and there are there are no ends to these conflicts. It's something U.S. should not be involved. I understand all that, and I acknowledge all that, and again I agree. But does the US and other countries have a choice, actually? That is the real question. I don't think we do. I mean, the US has to protect its allies, friends. It has to show that if the US has a good intention. The US has to show that it's not only transactional, that we only protect, like, for example, a country like Saudi Arabia and give them weapons, and even Israel, but it's also about all our allies. It's about our principles, and we cannot just go try to protect some because they either have the means to benefit us directly financially or militarily, but it's also about our principles, and it's about our future allies that also could be as strong and as good allies as the one we have now. So I don't think the US has an option. And if they otherwise, if they chose to be for it to be transactional and only protect those who they feel that because they want to protect them because it helped the US financially or whatever, then I think that is a losing battle in the future, and everyone will lose the trust in the US foreign policy, and it will bring more issues in the future. It's not a good plan.
Finally, with respect to the ECG community here, I think it's great that stories like what you have written are getting out and hopefully may get attention, get curiosity about understanding more, and not only commemorate the memory of your friend, which is wonderful in itself, but also get general populations learning about something that may be new to them, that may be different for them, but what can be done to help the community and strengthen the community here.
So again, I mean, I think that that would depend on the people who wants to help. There's certainly so many things that people can do, and it really sometimes when people ask me, I sometimes tell them, "What are you passionate about?" And then you can find a way to help. And sometimes we try to encourage more Yazidis, even in the US, to go to school, to start businesses, to be active in their communities, to be positively active in their communities. And Yazidi youth, a lot of them, they are recent immigrants, they need help, they need guidance. And even becoming a friend, a good friend with a Yazidi, that it can go a long way. You just can be that good friend that just guide them, because you were privileged, or you were lucky that you had good fathers, or good community taking care of you, guiding you. You could be that person. And you could, if you are a journalist, you can write something. If you're a story writer, you certainly can write a story. You can find so many stories that you can write that also can even maybe hopefully benefit those people financially, because they are human stories. They are stories that people can relate to. And so it really, it would depend. And if you are a human rights activist, you can go and document the human rights violation. You can document the hate speech. So again, I will leave that to your listeners and viewers to just see what their passion and how they can help. But basically, everyone can help in their own ways, and based on what they are passionate about.
Well, thank you so much. It was really a very insightful look into something that I think for many people they don't know much about. They may have heard something somewhere, but it's always good to bring the story directly to the viewers. And I encourage everyone to read the book, to get it on Amazon or in Barnes and Nobles. And also to engage as much as possible, to learn as much as possible, to get in touch with the members of ACG community like Hadi, and just learn more and figure out if this is something that you're interested in, and perhaps find a way to help, because there are wonderful human stories here, there are wonderful connections, but there's also the danger of a very interesting culture being eradicated thanks to hatred but also indifference and ignorance. And also, if you're in Iraq, see what can be done to take on sort of a leadership and provide guidance and provide framework that can prevent future tragedies and atrocities from taking place, because the community remains vulnerable and the threats remain very high at this time, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Irina, for the opportunity, and I'm so glad that I think we met once in New York, but I'm glad that we met again via Zoom, and I hope whoever reads the book, they will like it. As I said, this is my first book. I'm not a professional storyteller. I do have my PhD in education, and my dissertation was on Iraq, but I wrote this book to just kind of honor the memory of my friend and tell some of the stories that we just talked about, through that stories, and how we try to understand and grasp what's happening around us, and who we are, and why things were happening to us the way we're happening. And even if you read the book, you see, like, I talk about how these two main characters, which they are based on my friend and my character, seeing their dreams is being stripped away from them every step. And by the time they grow up and reach the college, they found themselves with almost no dreams left, except surviving and helping their families.
I think that's tragic, but I also think it's important to hear these voices, to understand what's going on, and to hear directly, and to learn about these individuals, and to learn about these human connections as well. And really, I really hope everyone will take something away from this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
For
Thank you, Rina. Thanks so much for having me.
For everyone who's been viewing the program, please don't forget, we'll be back next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. And thank you for tuning in. Have a great evening.